Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the military training ground, watching other recruits stretch and prepare for their morning physical training session. The sun was barely rising over Camp Pendleton, casting long shadows across the obstacle course that had become both her greatest challenge and deepest source of shame over the past 3 weeks. At 24, Sarah looked like any other military recruit from a distance. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, her uniform pressed and clean, her boots polished to a mirror shine. But, beneath the carefully maintained exterior lay secrets that she carried like stones in her chest, weighing heavier with each passing day at the training facility. Martinez. The sharp voice of Drill Sergeant Thompson cut through the morning air like a blade. What are you doing standing there like a statue? Get your gear and fall in with the others. Sarah's stomach twisted into familiar knots as she jogged toward the group of 30 other recruits who were already beginning their warm-up exercises. She had been dreading this moment since she woke up at 0500 hours, the same dread that filled her every morning when she knew PT was scheduled. The other recruits barely glanced at her as she took her position at the back of the formation. Over the past month, she had earned a reputation as the weak link, the one who always had an excuse, the one who couldn't keep up. What they didn't know, what none of them could see, was the network of scars that crisscrossed her torso beneath her uniform, or the titanium rod that had replaced a section of her spine after the car accident that had changed everything 3 years ago. Today we're doing the full obstacle course, announced Sergeant Thompson, his weathered face showing no emotion as he scanned the group of recruits. I want to see improvement from all of you. No excuses, no shortcuts, and, definitely no quitting. His eyes lingered on Sarah for just a moment longer than the others, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had become the example of what not to do, the cautionary tale that he used to motivate the others. Last week, when she had asked to skip rope climbing due to personal reasons, he had made the entire unit run an extra mile as punishment for her perceived laziness. As the group began moving toward the first obstacle, Sarah felt the familiar ache in her lower back that signaled the beginning of what would likely be a day filled with hidden agony. The morning was cool, but sweat was already forming on her forehead, not from exertion but from anxiety about what was to come. The first obstacle was a series of hurdles that required explosive jumping movements. Sarah watched as recruit after recruit sailed over them with ease, their young bodies responding exactly as they had been trained to do. When her turn came, she approached the first hurdle with determination, trying to ignore the sharp protest from her spine as she launched herself upward. She cleared the first one, but just barely. The landing sent shock waves through her reconstructed back, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. By the third hurdle, she was visibly struggling, her form deteriorating with each jump. "Come on, Martinez," shouted Private Johnson, one of the more athletic recruits. "My grandmother could do better than that." The comment drew laughter from several others, and Sarah felt her face flush with humiliation. She wanted to explain, wanted to tell them about the months of physical therapy, the doctors who had told her she was lucky to be walking at all, the fact that she was pushing her body far beyond what was medically advisable just to be there. But military training didn't allow for explanations or sob stories. It only recognized results. She stumbled on the fourth hurdle, catching herself with her hands and sending another jolt of pain through her spine. The laughter grew louder, and she heard someone mutter about how she didn't belong there. Each word was like a small knife, cutting away at the confidence she had worked so hard to rebuild after the accident. The next obstacle was the rope climb, 30 feet of thick manila rope that led to a platform high above the ground. Sarah stared up at it, knowing that the twisting motion required to climb would likely leave her in agony for the rest of the day. But, she also knew that backing down again would only reinforce the reputation she had already earned. She grabbed the rope and began to climb, using her arms to pull herself up while trying to minimize the strain on her back. Every few feet, she had to pause, ostensibly to catch her breath but really to manage the waves of pain that threatened to overwhelm her. Below, she could hear impatient grumbling from the other recruits who were waiting their turn. "This is ridiculous," she heard someone say. She's holding up the entire exercise. Halfway up the rope, Sarah's strength began to fail. Her arms trembled with exertion, and her back felt like it was on fire. She looked down at the faces below, some annoyed, others openly mocking, and made a decision that she would regret for weeks to come. "I can't do it," she called down, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I need to come down." The groans and complaints from below were immediate and harsh. Sergeant Thompson's face was a mask of disgust as he watched her slowly descend the rope, and she could see him making notes on his clipboard that she knew would not be favorable. "Martinez, see me after PT," he barked, not bothering to look at her directly. "The rest of you, keep moving. We don't have all day to wait for quitters." The word quitter hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had never quit anything in her life before the accident. She had been a star athlete in high school, competing in track and field and earning a partial scholarship to college. She had been the one encouraging others, pushing her teammates to achieve their best. Now she was the one being pushed aside, labeled as weak and uncommitted. The remainder of the obstacle course passed in a blur of humiliation. She attempted each challenge, completing some and failing others, always aware of the eyes watching her, judging her, finding her wanting. By the time they reached the final obstacle, a wall climb that required significant core strength, she was already defeated in spirit if not in body. The wall stood 12 feet high, with small handholds scattered across its surface. Other recruits attacked it with enthusiasm, pulling themselves up with confidence and dropping down on the other side with triumphant grins. When Sarah's turn came, she stood at the base of the wall and looked up, knowing that the twisting and stretching required would be nearly impossible given her limitations. She made it halfway up before her back seized completely, a spasm so severe that she nearly fell. Clinging to the wall with white knuckles, she tried to breathe through the pain, but it was no use. She had pushed too far, demanded too much from a body that was still healing, still broken in ways that didn't show. "I can't finish," she said quietly, lowering herself back to the ground. The admission felt like swallowing glass, each word scraping against her throat as it came out. The reaction was swift and merciless. Several recruits threw their hands up in exasperation, while others shook their heads in disgust. She heard someone say that she was wasting everyone's time, that she obviously wasn't cut out for military service, that she should just quit and save everyone the trouble. Sergeant Thompson walked over to where she stood, his expression unreadable. "Martinez, you're excused from the rest of PT, report to my office at 1400 hours. We need to have a serious conversation about your future here." As the other recruits continued with their training, Sarah walked slowly back toward the barracks, each step a reminder of her failure. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of success, recruits cheering each other on, completing obstacles, pushing themselves to be better. She had wanted so desperately to be part of that, to prove that she belonged despite everything she had been through. In her small, sparse room, Sarah sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at herself in the mirror mounted on the opposite wall. The face looking back at her was flushed with exertion and embarrassment, but it was the eyes that bothered her most. They held a defeat that she hadn't seen since those first dark weeks after the accident, when she had wondered if her life was effectively over. She pulled out a small photo from her footlocker, one of her crossing the finish line at the state track championships during her senior year of high school. In the picture, her face was radiant with joy and achievement, her body strong and capable, her future full of endless possibilities. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime who had lived in a different world. The accident had happened on a rainy night in November during her junior year of college. She had been driving home from her job at a local restaurant, tired from a long shift but happy because she had earned enough to cover her textbooks for the next semester. The drunk driver who ran the red light had stolen more than just her physical capabilities, he had taken her identity, her confidence, and her belief in her own strength. The months of recovery had been a nightmare of surgeries, physical therapy, and slowly learning to walk again. The doctors had been amazed at her progress, calling her recovery miraculous. But, Sarah knew the truth that they couldn't see in their X-rays and MRI scans. She was broken in ways that went beyond the physical, fractured in places that might never fully heal. Joining the military had been her way of reclaiming herself, of proving that she was still the strong, capable person she had once been. She had worked for 2 years to get physically ready for basic training, pushing herself through private workouts that left her exhausted and aching. She had studied military history and protocol, practiced until she could disassemble and reassemble weapons in her sleep, memorized regulations until she could recite them backward. But, none of that preparation had prepared her for the reality of having to perform while hiding her limitations, of being judged by people who couldn't see the battles she had already fought and won. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, trying to balance pushing herself hard enough to meet standards while not pushing so hard that she seriously injured herself. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Martinez, you have a visitor," called out Private Davis, one of the few recruits who hadn't openly mocked her struggles. Sarah opened the door to find Colonel James Harrison standing in the hallway, his tall frame filling the doorway and his stern expression making her stomach drop even further. Colonel Harrison was a legend at Camp Pendleton, a former Navy SEAL who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq before transitioning to a training role. He was known for his impossibly high standards and his complete intolerance for weakness of any kind. "Colonel Harrison, sir," Sarah said, snapping to attention despite the protest from her back. "At ease, Martinez. I'd like to speak with you privately." Sarah stepped aside to let him into her small room, her mind racing with possibilities. Had Sergeant Thompson already reported her poor performance? Was this the conversation where she would be told that her military career was over before it had truly begun? Colonel Harrison looked around the sparse room, taking in the perfectly made bed, the spotless floors, and the carefully organized personal items. His eyes lingered on the photo from her track days that still sat on her desk. "Sergeant Thompson tells me you've been having some difficulties with physical training," he said, his voice neutral but carrying an undertone of authority that made Sarah stand even straighter. "Yes, sir. I know my performance hasn't been adequate. I'm working to improve." Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment, his sharp blue eyes seeming to look right through her. "Tell me about this improvement, Martinez. What specifically are you doing to address your limitations?" The word limitations stung, even though Sarah knew he was simply stating facts. She had limitations, serious ones that affected her ability to perform at the level expected of military personnel. But, hearing it from someone of Colonel Harrison's stature made it feel like an official verdict on her worthlessness. "I've been working out during my free time, sir. Extra cardio, strength training, stretching. I know I need to build up my endurance and overall fitness level." "And, how's that working out for you?" The question was simple, but Sarah heard the skepticism in his tone. How could she explain that her extra workouts often left her unable to sleep from the pain, or that her strength training was carefully modified to avoid the movements that might damage her reconstructed spine further? It's a process, sir. I'm making progress, but I know I have a long way to go." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly, then moved to look out the small window that faced the training grounds. In the distance, Sarah could see other recruits still working through exercises, their movements fluid and confident in a way that hers had never been since arriving at camp. "Do you know why I'm here, Martinez?" "No, sir. I make it my business to know about every recruit who comes through this facility, especially those who are struggling. I've been watching you for the past 3 weeks, and I have some questions." Sarah's heart rate increased, and she felt sweat beginning to form on her palms. If Colonel Harrison had been watching her, then he had seen every failure, every moment of weakness, every time she had backed down from a challenge. "You have an interesting file," he continued, still looking out the window. "High school athlete, good grades, strong letters of recommendation. Clean background check, no red flags in your psychological evaluation. And, yet, here you are, consistently underperforming in every physical metric we use to evaluate recruits." He turned to face her directly, and Sarah felt pinned under his gaze like a specimen under a microscope. "So I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Is there something you're not telling us about your physical condition?" The question hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah felt her mouth go dry and her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. This was the moment she had been dreading since the day she arrived, the moment when someone would ask the right question and force her to choose between continuing her deception or admitting the truth that would likely end everything. She thought about the months of preparation, the dreams she had invested in this opportunity, the chance to prove to herself that she was still whole despite everything she had been through. But, she also thought about the pain that was her constant companion, the fear that drove every decision she made about what her body could and couldn't handle, and the exhaustion of trying to appear strong when she felt broken. "Sir, She began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Colonel Harrison waited, his expression patient but expectant. In that moment, Sarah realized that he already knew something was wrong. The question wasn't whether he suspected her of hiding something, it was whether she was going to be honest about it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of a decision that would change everything. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment, feeling the familiar ache in her back and the newer ache in her heart, and prepared to either save her secret or surrender it completely. Sarah opened her eyes and met Colonel Harrison's steady gaze. The seconds ticked by like hours as she wrestled with a decision that felt impossible. Tell the truth and risk losing everything she had worked toward, or continue the lie that was slowly destroying her from the inside. "No, sir," she finally said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "There's nothing I haven't disclosed." Colonel Harrison's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been disappointment. He nodded once, a sharp, military acknowledgement that somehow felt like a verdict. "Very well, Martinez. I'll be frank with you. Your current performance is not meeting the standards required for military service. You have 2 weeks to show significant improvement, or we'll be having a different kind of conversation about your future here." "Yes, sir. I understand. I hope you do." Dismissed. As Colonel Harrison left her room, Sarah felt the weight of her decision settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had chosen to continue living the lie, to keep pushing her broken body beyond its limits rather than admit the truth that might have saved her. But, saved her for what? A medical discharge? A return to civilian life where she would always wonder if she could have made it if she had just tried harder. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the mess hall, picking at her dinner while around her the other recruits shared stories and jokes from their day of training. She had become increasingly isolated over the past weeks, partly by choice and partly because the others had grown tired of her constant limitations and excuses. "Hey Martinez," called out Private Rodriguez, one of the more popular recruits. "I heard Colonel Harrison paid you a visit today. Finally, getting kicked out." The comment drew snickers from several nearby tables, and Sarah felt her face burn with shame. She wanted to defend herself, to say something sharp and clever that would put Rodriguez in his place, but the words wouldn't come. How could she argue when part of her wondered if he might be right? "Leave her alone, Rodriguez," said a quiet voice from behind Sarah. She turned to see Private Lisa Chen, a petite recruit from California who had never been particularly friendly but had never joined in the mocking either. "Oh come on, Chen. We're all thinking it. She can't keep up with the rest of us, and it's affecting our unit scores. Some of us actually want to succeed here. Some of us also understand that everyone has different challenges," Lisa replied calmly, sitting down across from Sarah. "Maybe you should worry more about your own performance and less about hers." Rodriguez muttered something under his breath but turned back to his own table, and the attention gradually shifted away from Sarah. She looked at Lisa with surprise, wondering why she had chosen to intervene. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." Lisa shrugged. My older brother went through basic training 5 years ago. He told me that the people who spend all their time tearing others down are usually the ones who are most afraid of failing themselves. The simple wisdom in her words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She had been so focused on her own struggles that she hadn't really considered what the other recruits might be going through. Everyone here had their own fears, their own insecurities, their own reasons for needing to prove themselves. Can I ask you something? Lisa continued, lowering her voice. And, you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But, is there something going on with you that the rest of us don't know about? Sarah's chest tightened. Even Lisa, who barely knew her, could see that something was wrong. How long could she keep up the pretense that she was just out of shape or unmotivated when the truth was written in every careful movement she made? Why would you ask that? Because I've been watching you, and you don't move like someone who's just lazy or unfit. You move like someone who's in pain but trying to hide it. The observation was so accurate that Sarah felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. For weeks, she had felt completely alone in her struggle, convinced that no one could see past her carefully maintained facade. To learn that at least one person had noticed, had seen through to the reality she was trying to hide, was both terrifying and, oddly comforting. I can't talk about it, Sarah whispered. I'm sorry, but, I just can't. Lisa nodded understandingly. That's okay. But, if you ever need someone to listen, or if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. This place is hard enough without going through it alone. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling and, thinking about Lisa's words. She had been going through everything alone, carrying the weight of her secret and, her pain without any support or understanding from the people around her. But, was that really necessary? Or was it just pride that kept her isolated? She thought about the conversation with Colonel Harrison, replaying every word and, trying to read between the lines. He had asked if there was something she wasn't telling them about her physical condition, which suggested that he suspected something specific. But, what if she had told him the truth? What if she had explained about the accident, the surgeries, the ongoing challenges she faced every single day? The rational part of her mind knew that honesty might have led to accommodation rather than dismissal. The military had protocols for dealing with medical issues, ways to work with limitations while still allowing people to serve. But, Sarah's fear ran deeper than rational thought. She was terrified that any admission of weakness would confirm what she suspected about herself, that she was fundamentally broken, permanently damaged, and, incapable of being the strong person she had once been. The next morning brought another PT session, this one focused on endurance running. Sarah knew that long-distance running was particularly challenging for her back, but, she also knew that she couldn't afford another obvious failure after her conversation with Colonel Harrison. As the group assembled at the starting line for a 5-mile run through the hills surrounding the base, Sarah tried to prepare herself mentally for what was to come. She had taken extra pain medication the night before, something she rarely allowed herself to do, hoping it would help her get through the run without obvious signs of distress. Today we're going to separate the wheat from the chaff, announced Sergeant Thompson, his voice carrying across the morning air. This run will show me who's serious about being here and, who's just wasting my time. His eyes found Sarah in the group, and, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She had become his favorite example of what not to do, and, she could see him already preparing to use her as motivation for the others. The run began at a moderate pace, with the group staying together for the first mile. Sarah managed to keep up, though she could already feel the familiar burning sensation beginning in her lower back. She focused on her breathing, on maintaining proper form, on anything except the growing pain that threatened to overwhelm her concentration. By the second mile, the group had begun to stretch out, with the stronger runners pulling ahead and, the stragglers falling behind. Sarah found herself in the middle of the pack, running alongside Lisa Chen and, a few others who were maintaining a steady but, not spectacular pace. How are you doing? Lisa asked quietly, running close enough that only Sarah could hear her. I'm okay, Sarah replied, though the tightness in her voice suggested otherwise. The pain in her back was intensifying with each step, and she could feel the early warning signs of a muscle spasm beginning to develop. By the third mile, Sarah was struggling visibly. Her stride had shortened, and she was breathing heavily despite the relatively moderate pace they were maintaining. Other recruits began passing her, and she could hear some of them making comments about her obvious difficulty. "Come on, Martinez," shouted someone from behind her. "My grandmother runs faster than that." The comment was similar to one she had heard before, but today it hit differently. Today she was running on the edge of serious injury, pushing her body beyond what was safe or smart, all to avoid the humiliation of being seen as weak. The unfairness of the situation, being mocked for limitations that were the result of someone else's reckless decision, suddenly, felt overwhelming. She stumbled slightly, catching herself before she fell but losing valuable ground in the process. The pain in her back was now constant and severe, radiating down her left leg in a way that made each step feel like stepping on broken glass. "I can't keep this up," she whispered to herself, though she continued running despite her words. Stopping would mean facing Sergeant Thompson's wrath, enduring more humiliation in front of the group, and potentially triggering the conversation about her future that Colonel Harrison had threatened. By the fourth mile, Sarah was running purely on willpower and stubbornness. Her form had deteriorated completely, and she was essentially limping forward at what could barely be called a running pace. The other recruits had spread out ahead of her, leaving her alone with her pain and her growing panic about what would happen if she couldn't finish. Lisa had stayed back with her, running circles around Sarah's position to maintain her own workout while offering quiet encouragement. "You're doing great," she said. "Just focus on putting one foot in front of the other." But Sarah knew she wasn't doing great. She was barely hanging on, and the finish line seemed impossibly far away. With each step, the spasm in her back grew worse, and she began to worry that she was doing permanent damage to her spine. The titanium rod that stabilized her vertebrae felt like it was shifting with each impact, though she knew that was impossible. As they approached the final mile marker, Sarah's body finally rebelled completely. The spasm that had been building throughout the run suddenly intensified to the point where she couldn't take another step. She stumbled to a halt, doubled over in agony, and found herself unable to straighten up. "Martinez!" Lisa called out, immediately stopping her own run to check on Sarah. "What's wrong? What's happening?" Sarah tried to answer, but the pain was so intense that she couldn't form words. She was trapped in a bent position, her back locked in spasm, while around her she could hear the voices of other recruits who had stopped to see what was happening. "Is she having some kind of attack?" someone asked. "Should we call for medical assistance?" "Probably just faking it to get out of finishing the run." That last comment, delivered in a tone of casual dismissal, cut through Sarah's pain like a blade. Even in her current state, writhing in agony and unable to move properly, some people still assumed she was being dramatic or dishonest. The injustice of it all suddenly felt like more than she could bear. Sergeant Thompson jogged back from the front of the group, his expression a mixture of annoyance and concern. "What's the situation here, Martinez?" I can't move," Sarah managed to gasp out between waves of pain. "My back, something's wrong." Thompson's expression shifted from annoyance to something that might have been genuine concern. In all his years of training recruits, he had seen plenty of people try to fake injuries to avoid difficult exercises, but he had also seen enough real medical emergencies to recognize the signs. "Chen, run ahead and get the medical team," he ordered. "Tell them we need transport back to base. Everyone else, give her some space." As Lisa ran off to get help, Sarah found herself sitting on the ground beside the trail, still unable to straighten her back completely. The other recruits had formed a loose circle around her, some showing genuine concern while others whispered among themselves about whether this was another example of her weakness. "Martinez," Sergeant Thompson said, crouching down beside her. "I need you to be honest with me. Is this related to a pre-existing condition?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could continue lying, could claim that this was just a random injury that could happen to anyone. Or she could finally tell the truth that she had been hiding since the day she arrived at camp. She looked up at the faces surrounding her, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all waiting for her answer. In that moment, with pain radiating through her entire body and her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her, Sarah realized that the truth might actually be a relief. But, before she could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles indicated that help was on the way. Whatever conversation was about to happen would have to wait until after the medical team had evaluated her condition. As she heard the doors slamming and voices calling out instructions, Sarah wondered if this was the moment when everything would finally come out, when her secret would be exposed and her military dreams would officially come to an end. The paramedics who approached her were professional and efficient, quickly assessing her condition and preparing to transport her back to the base medical facility. As they carefully helped her onto a stretcher, Sarah caught sight of Colonel Harrison's distinctive figure standing near one of the vehicles, his expression unreadable as he watched the proceedings. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Sarah saw something in his gaze that she couldn't quite interpret. It wasn't anger or disappointment, but rather a kind of knowing look, as if he had been expecting something like this to happen. The realization that he might have already suspected the truth about her condition was both terrifying and strangely comforting. As the medical vehicle pulled away from the training area, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever conversations lay ahead. The secret she had guarded so carefully was about to be examined by medical professionals who would undoubtedly discover the truth about her condition. There would be X-rays and examinations and questions that she couldn't deflect or avoid. But, perhaps most importantly, there would be Colonel Harrison, who had given her the opportunity to be honest and who now had every reason to feel that she had deceived him. Whatever happened next, Sarah knew that her time of hiding was finally coming to an end, one way or another. The base medical facility smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner, familiar scents that took Sarah back to the months she had spent in hospitals after the accident. She lay on an examination table in a small treatment room, still wearing her PT uniform but now with a hospital gown over it, waiting for the doctor to return with her X-ray results. The pain medication they had given her had dulled the sharp edges of the spasm, but she could still feel the deep ache in her back that never really went away. More than the physical discomfort, though, she was wrestling with the anxiety of knowing that her secret was about to be exposed to everyone who mattered. Dr. Patricia Williams, the base physician, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Sarah of her own mother. She had examined Sarah thoroughly, asking gentle but probing questions about her pain level and range of motion, and Sarah could see the growing concern in her expression as the examination progressed. A knock on the door interrupted Sarah's worried thoughts. "Come in," Dr. Williams called out, and Sarah's heart sank as Colonel Harrison entered the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. "Colonel," Dr. Williams acknowledged with a professional nod. "I was just about to review Miss Martinez's results with her. I'd like to be present for that conversation, if that's acceptable to the patient," Colonel Harrison said, his eyes meeting Sarah's with an intensity that made her want to look away. Sarah nodded reluctantly. There was no point in trying to delay the inevitable any longer, and part of her was actually relieved that the truth was finally going to come out. Dr. Williams pulled up Sarah's X-rays on a computer screen mounted on the wall, and Sarah felt her stomach drop as she saw her own spine displayed in stark black and white detail. The titanium rod was clearly visible, running along several vertebrae, with the telltale signs of surgical hardware that no one could mistake for anything else. "Miss Martinez," Dr. Williams began, her voice gentle but serious, "these X-rays show evidence of significant spinal surgery. There's a titanium rod stabilizing your L2 through L5 vertebrae, as well as signs of extensive soft tissue reconstruction. This is not recent work. I'd estimate these surgeries were performed at least 2 to 3 years ago." Colonel Harrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see his jaw tighten slightly as he processed the information. She felt like a fraud who had finally been caught, exposed in front of the one person whose respect she most wanted to earn. Can you tell me about the circumstances that led to these surgeries? Dr. Williams continued. Sarah took a shaky breath, knowing that this was the moment when she would either tell the complete truth or dig herself even deeper into deception. Looking at the X-rays of her own broken and reconstructed spine, she realized that there was no point in lying anymore. Car accident, she said quietly. 3 years ago. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit me head-on. I almost died. The words felt strange coming out of her mouth after months of carefully avoiding any mention of the accident. For so long, she had tried to pretend that it hadn't happened, that she was the same person she had been before that terrible night. What were the extent of your injuries? Dr. Williams asked, making notes in Sarah's file. Shattered vertebrae, severed spinal cord, extensive internal injuries. I was paralyzed for 6 months. They said I might never walk again. Sarah's voice was getting stronger as she continued, as if finally, telling the truth was giving her back some of her own power. But, you did walk again, Colonel Harrison observed, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Yes, sir. It took 2 years of physical therapy, but I learned to walk again. The doctors called it a miracle. And yet you didn't disclose any of this information when you enlisted, he continued, his tone neutral but with an undercurrent of something that might have been disappointment. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame. No, sir. I was afraid that if I told the truth, I wouldn't be accepted into the program. Dr. Williams continued her examination of the X-rays, pointing out various details to Colonel Harrison. This is actually quite remarkable surgical work, she said. The reconstruction is very well done, and the healing appears to be complete. However, the kind of activities required in military training could potentially cause serious complications. What kind of complications? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Stress fractures around the surgical hardware, disc degeneration above and below the fused area, potential damage to the surrounding soft tissue. The human spine isn't designed to handle the kind of impact and stress that comes with obstacle courses, long runs, and heavy equipment. Colonel Harrison studied the X-rays for a long moment before turning his attention back to Sarah. Why didn't you tell me the truth when I asked you directly yesterday? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had hoped that Colonel Harrison wouldn't bring up their previous conversation, but she should have known that a man of his caliber would remember every detail of their interaction. I was scared, she admitted. I've wanted to serve in the military since I was a little girl. After the accident, everyone told me that dream was over, that I needed to find something else to do with my life. But, I couldn't accept that. I worked so hard to get to the point where I could even attempt basic training. I was terrified that if I told the truth, you'd send me home before I even had a chance to prove myself. And, instead, you chose to put yourself at serious risk of permanent injury, Dr. Williams interjected. Miss Martinez, what you've been doing is incredibly dangerous. This spasm you experienced today could have been much worse. You could have caused damage that might have left you paralyzed again. The words hung heavy in the air, and Sarah felt the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She had been so focused on proving that she wasn't broken that she had risked breaking herself even further. I need to ask, Colonel Harrison said, his voice carefully controlled, have there been other incidents? Other times when your condition has affected your performance but you didn't report it? Sarah looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes as she answered. Yes, sir. Pretty much every day since I arrived. The pain it's always there. Some days are better than others, but it never completely goes away. Every day, he repeated, and Sarah could hear something like amazement in his voice. You've been training through constant pain for 3 weeks. Yes, sir. Colonel Harrison was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah began to prepare herself for the lecture about dishonesty and the dangers of concealing medical information. She expected anger, disappointment, and ultimately dismissal from the program. "Dr. Williams," he finally said, "what's your professional assessment of Miss Martinez's ability to continue with military training?" Dr. Williams looked uncomfortable with the question. "Colonel, given the extent of her injuries and the current state of her hardware, I would strongly advise against continuing with standard basic training protocols. The risk of serious injury is simply too high." Sarah felt her heart break as the doctor's words confirmed what she had been afraid to hear. Her military dreams were officially over, ended by the truth she had tried so hard to hide. However, Dr. Williams continued, "That doesn't necessarily mean that military service is completely out of the question. There are other roles within the military that might be suitable for someone with her limitations, positions that don't require the same level of physical demands." "Such as?" Colonel Harrison asked. "Intelligence analysis, communications, logistics, administrative roles. Many essential military positions don't require the ability to complete obstacle courses or long-distance running." Sarah looked up in surprise. She had been so focused on the idea of being a combat soldier that she hadn't really considered other ways to serve. But, even as hope began to flutter in her chest, she realized that Colonel Harrison might not be interested in alternative roles for someone who had deceived him so thoroughly. "Miss Martinez," Colonel Harrison said, turning to face her directly, "I want you to understand something. What you did was extremely dangerous, not just to yourself but, potentially to others who might have had to depend on you in a combat situation. Concealing medical information is a serious breach of trust." "Yes, sir. I understand. However," he continued, and Sarah's breath caught at the unexpected word, "I also want you to understand that what you've accomplished is remarkable. Most people who go through the kind of trauma you experienced never fully recover. The fact that you not only learned to walk again but pushed yourself to the point where you could even attempt basic training shows a level of determination that is impressive." Sarah stared at him in shock. She had expected condemnation, not praise, especially after everything that had just been revealed. "The question now," Colonel Harrison continued, "is what we do going forward. You obviously can't continue with standard basic training, but Dr. Williams is right that there are other ways to serve." "I don't understand, sir." Colonel Harrison walked over to the window and looked out at the training grounds where other recruits were continuing their exercises. "Miss Martinez, the military is full of people who have overcome significant challenges to serve their country. We have soldiers who've lost limbs, veterans who deal with PTSD, people who've had to adapt to physical limitations while still finding ways to contribute." He turned back to face her, and Sarah was surprised to see something that looked almost like respect in his eyes. "What you did was wrong, the deception, the concealment of medical information, the risk you put yourself and, potentially others in. But, the drive that motivated those decisions, the refusal to give up on your dreams despite overwhelming obstacles, that's exactly the kind of spirit we need in the military." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she processed his words. After weeks of feeling like a failure, like someone who didn't belong, she was hearing that her struggles might actually have value. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we figure out how to channel that determination into a role that matches your capabilities," Colonel Harrison said. "Dr. Williams, what kind of medical clearance would Miss Martinez need for non-combat roles?" Dr. Williams consulted her notes. "With proper accommodations and limitations on physical activities, I could probably clear her for desk duties, technical positions, things that don't involve heavy lifting or high-impact activities. And, there are plenty of those positions available," Colonel Harrison added. "Intelligence analysis, cybersecurity, communications, logistics coordination. All critical roles that require intelligence, determination, and attention to detail, qualities that Miss Martinez has clearly demonstrated." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with lingering uncertainty. "But, what about my lying to you? What about the fact that I concealed my medical history?" Colonel Harrison was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "That will have to be addressed through proper channels. There will likely be disciplinary action, and you'll need to go through additional psychological evaluation to ensure that you understand the importance of honesty in military service. But, it doesn't necessarily mean the end of my military career. Not necessarily, no. What it means is that we need to find a different path forward, one that acknowledges your limitations while still allowing you to serve. Dar. Williams began gathering up Sarah's X-rays and medical files. I'll need to do some additional evaluations over the next few days, but I think we can work out a medical profile that will allow for limited duty with accommodations. As the doctor left the room, Colonel Harrison remained behind with Sarah. The silence stretched between them for a moment before he spoke again. There's something else we need to discuss, he said, his tone becoming more serious. The way you've been treated by some of the other recruits, the comments and mockery you've endured, that's not acceptable, regardless of your medical situation. Sarah looked up in surprise. She hadn't realized that Colonel Harrison was aware of the harassment she had been experiencing. I've heard the comments, seen the behavior. No one should have to endure that kind of treatment, especially not someone who's pushing through the kind of challenges you've been dealing with. I thought maybe I deserved it, Sarah said quietly. Because I wasn't able to keep up. Absolutely not, Colonel Harrison said firmly. Respect and basic human decency aren't earned through physical performance. They're fundamental rights that every person deserves, regardless of their capabilities or limitations. The conviction in his voice surprised Sarah. She had expected many things from this conversation, but a defense of her dignity wasn't one of them. There will be some changes made to address that behavior, he continued. And, when you transition to your new role, you'll be working with people who understand the value of diverse skills and capabilities. Sarah nodded, still processing everything that had happened in the past hour. Her carefully guarded secret was out, her deception had been exposed, but somehow she wasn't being sent home in disgrace. Instead, she was being offered a chance to serve in a different way, to find a path forward that acknowledged both her limitations and her strengths. Thank you, she said quietly. For not giving up on me. For seeing something worth saving. Colonel Harrison's expression softened slightly. Miss Martinez, what you've been through, what you've overcome, and what you've accomplished, that's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. The military needs people who understand what it means to fight through adversity, to keep going when everything seems hopeless. As Sarah prepared to leave the medical facility, she reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in just a few hours. The truth that she had been so afraid to reveal had indeed changed everything, but not in the way she had expected. Instead of ending her military dreams, it had opened up new possibilities that she hadn't even known existed. The road ahead would still be challenging, and she would have to prove herself all over again in a different context. But, for the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, Sarah felt like she might actually belong somewhere in the military, even if it wasn't in the role she had originally envisioned. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in Colonel Harrison's office, wearing a clean uniform and feeling more nervous than she had since her first day at Camp Pendleton. The disciplinary hearing that would determine her future in the military was scheduled to begin in an hour, and she still wasn't sure what to expect. The past 14 days had been a whirlwind of medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and interviews with various officers who were trying to determine whether she could be trusted to serve despite her initial deception. Sarah had answered every question honestly this time, holding nothing back about her accident, her recovery, or her motivations for concealing the truth. "How are you feeling?" Colonel Harrison asked, gesturing for her to take a seat across from his desk. "Nervous," Sarah admitted. "But, also, relieved, I think. It feels good not to be hiding anymore." Colonel Harrison nodded. "The truth has a way of doing that. Even when it's difficult, honesty tends to be less exhausting than deception." He pulled out a thick file that Sarah recognized as her case folder. Over the past 2 weeks, it had grown significantly as various professionals had added their evaluations and recommendations. "I wanted to speak with you before the hearing begins," he said. There are some things you should know about what's been happening behind the scenes. Sarah's anxiety increased. What kind of things? First, the medical evaluation. Dr. Williams and her team have been very thorough in their assessment. They've concluded that while you cannot safely participate in standard combat training, you are fully capable of performing many military roles with minor accommodations. That was encouraging news, but Sarah could sense there was more coming. Second, the psychological evaluation. The psychiatrist wanted to understand your decision-making process, your motivations, and your mental state. Her report is interesting. Sarah waited, not sure whether interesting was good or bad in this context. Dr. Rebecca Foster concluded that while your decision to conceal your medical history was poor judgment, it was motivated by a genuine desire to serve rather than any intention to deceive for personal gain. She also noted that your ability to function through constant pain while maintaining performance standards shows remarkable mental resilience. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Does that mean she's recommending I be allowed to continue? With conditions, yes. But, there's something else, something that might surprise you. Colonel Harrison leaned forward in his chair. I've been doing some research into your background, beyond what was in your original enlistment file. Sarah's heart rate increased. What else could there be to discover about her past? I found some interesting articles from your local newspaper from 3 years ago. Articles about the accident, and, more importantly, about what you did immediately before the first responders arrived. Sarah's blood went cold. She had never talked about those first few minutes after the crash, had never told anyone about what happened before the ambulance arrived. It was a part of the story that she had buried so deeply that she rarely even thought about it herself. According to the police report and witness statements, Colonel Harrison continued, after your car was hit, while you were pinned in your vehicle with what we now know were severe spinal injuries, you spent nearly 20 minutes directing other drivers to help the occupants of the other vehicle. Sarah stared at him, not understanding why he was bringing this up. I don't see what that has to do with anything. Don't you? Colonel Harrison's voice was quiet but intense. Miss Martinez, you were partially paralyzed, trapped in a crushed vehicle, and, likely in shock. And, instead of focusing on your own survival, you used those 20 minutes to coordinate a rescue effort that saved 3 lives. The memories came flooding back, details that Sarah had tried to forget. The smell of gasoline and burning metal. The screams from the other car. The family of 4 who had been heading home from a birthday party when the drunk driver hit both their vehicles. The drunk driver died on impact, Colonel Harrison continued, reading from the reports. But, the family in the other car, a mother, father, and 2 young children, were all trapped in their vehicle, which had caught fire. According to witnesses, you were the one who directed traffic around the scene, who called out instructions for how to extract the family safely, who kept them calm until the fire department arrived. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she remembered that night. She had pushed the memories away because they were too painful, too tied up with her own trauma to process clearly. One witness said you never stopped talking to the children, keeping them calm and focused while adults worked to get them out. Another said you directed traffic with hand signals for nearly 15 minutes, making sure the rescue vehicles could get through. I don't remember it being that dramatic, Sarah said quietly. I just did what needed to be done. Exactly, Colonel Harrison said, and there was something in his voice that Sarah had never heard before. You just did what needed to be done. While you were seriously injured, while you were in pain and afraid, while your own life was in danger, you focused on your duty to help others. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was saying and why it mattered. But, that doesn't change the fact that I lied to get into the military. No, it doesn't. But, it does provide context for who you are as a person. It shows that when faced with a crisis, your instinct is to serve others rather than protect yourself. That's exactly the kind of character we need in the military, regardless of physical limitations. Colonel Harrison stood up and walked around his desk to stand in front of Sarah. There's something else you need to know before we go to the hearing. I've recommended that you receive a formal commendation for your actions on the night of the accident. Your behavior that night exemplified the military values of honor, courage, and commitment, even though you weren't in the service at the time. Sarah stared at him in shock. A commendation? But, I'm in trouble for lying about my medical history. You're facing discipline for poor judgment regarding disclosure of medical information. But, that doesn't erase the heroic actions you took as a civilian. The two issues are separate, and both need to be acknowledged. Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the door. Come in, Colonel Harrison called. The door opened to admit several people, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she recognized two of them. A middle-aged woman and a man in his early 30s entered the office, followed by Dr. Williams and another officer Sarah didn't recognize. Miss Martinez, the woman said, tears already forming in her eyes, I'm Margaret Chin. This is my son David. I believe you've been training with my daughter Lisa. Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process the connection. Lisa Chen had been the one recruit who had shown her kindness, who had defended her when others mocked her struggles. But, why were her family members here? We were in the car that night, David Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. 3 years ago, when the drunk driver hit us. You saved our lives. Sarah felt the world tilt around her as understanding dawned. The family she had helped rescue from the burning car was connected to the one person at camp who had treated her with compassion and understanding. We've been looking for you for 3 years, Margaret continued. We knew your name from the police reports, but we could never find you. When Lisa told us about a recruit named Martinez who seemed to be struggling with some kind of hidden injury, we wondered if it could possibly be you. When Colonel Harrison contacted us to verify the reports from that night, David added, we knew we had to come and thank you properly. You saved my parents, you saved my sister, and you saved me. We owe you everything. Sarah was crying now, overwhelmed by the unexpected reunion and the implications of what was happening. The family she had helped save had been living their lives, recovering from their own trauma, while she had been struggling with hers. And, through an incredible coincidence, their paths had crossed again at exactly the moment when she needed to remember who she really was beneath all her pain and fear. There's more, Colonel Harrison said gently. The officer you haven't met is Captain Rodriguez from the Awards and Recognition Division. He's here to present you with the Military Outstanding Volunteer Service Medal for your actions that night. Sarah looked around the room at all these people who had gathered to acknowledge something she had never even thought of as heroic. She had simply done what seemed right in the moment, responding to a crisis the only way she knew how. I still lied about my medical history, she said, feeling like she needed to acknowledge that her actions that night didn't excuse her more recent poor judgment. Yes, you did, Colonel Harrison agreed. And, there will be consequences for that. You'll receive a formal reprimand in your file, and you'll need to complete additional training on the importance of honesty in military service. But? Sarah sensed there was more coming. But, you'll also be transferred to a new position in military intelligence, where your analytical skills and attention to detail will be put to better use. You'll work with a team that understands the value of different perspectives and experiences. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with a small wooden box containing the medal. Miss Martinez, it's rare that we have the opportunity to recognize civilian heroism retroactively. Your actions on the night of November 15, 3 years ago demonstrated the highest ideals of service and sacrifice. You risked your own safety to save others, and you did so without hesitation or expectation of recognition. As he pinned the medal to her uniform, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle was finally being closed. The night that had taken so much from her, her physical capabilities, her sense of invincibility, her original life plans, had also revealed something essential about her character that she had forgotten in the years since. Margaret Chin approached her with tears streaming down her face. I want you to know that not a day goes by that we don't think about you, that we don't thank God for putting you in that intersection at that moment. You gave us back our lives, and now we have grandchildren who exist because of your courage. The hearing that followed was almost anticlimactic after the emotional reunion in Colonel Harrison's office. Sarah formally acknowledged her poor judgment in concealing her medical history, accepted the disciplinary action, and agreed to the terms of her transfer to a non-combat role. But, more importantly, she finally understood what Colonel Harrison had been trying to tell her about the difference between being broken and being different. Her physical limitations were real and would always be a factor in what she could and couldn't do. But, her character, her instinct to serve others even at personal cost, her determination to keep going despite overwhelming obstacles, those things weren't broken at all. As she left the hearing room, Sarah found Lisa Chen waiting for her in the hallway. The younger woman's eyes were red from crying, and she immediately pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. "I can't believe you're the one who saved my family," Lisa said. "I mean, I knew there was something special about you, but I never imagined. Thank you. Thank you for giving me back my parents and my brother. Thank you for being the only person here who treated me like a human being," Sarah replied. "Even when you didn't know our connection, you showed me kindness when I needed it most." 2 months later, Sarah sat in a climate-controlled intelligence analysis center, using her sharp mind to support military operations in ways that were just as important as anything happening on the front lines. Her back still hurt every day, and she still had to be careful about physical activities. But, she had found her place in the military, a role that utilized her strengths while acknowledging her limitations. The medal sat on her desk in a place of honor, not because of what it said about her past, but because of what it reminded her about her future. She was not broken. She was not a failure. She was a person who had faced extraordinary challenges and found extraordinary strength in response. And, in the end, that was exactly the kind of person the military needed, regardless of whether she could complete an obstacle course or run 5 miles without pain. Her service looked different than she had originally imagined, but it was no less valuable or meaningful. The scars on her back would always be there, hidden beneath her uniform but never forgotten. But, now she understood that scars weren't signs of weakness, they were proof of battles fought and survived, evidence of a strength that went far deeper than physical capability. Sarah Martinez had finally found her place in the military, not in spite of her limitations, but because of how she had learned to overcome them. And that made all the difference.